Have you ever walked into a place and felt like the world forgot how to respect the quiet ones? In a noisy world chasing fame, power, and likes, true dignity often sits alone, quiet, unnoticed, wiping tables for which no one says thank you. If you've ever felt like the values that built you, duty, respect, resilience, don't mean much anymore, this story is for you. Because today, in the most ordinary place, something extraordinary happened. Stick around. You'll walk away with more than a story. You'll walk away reminded of who you are. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that matter. It was a quiet afternoon in a small-town Burger King, the kind of day where time moved slowly, and the light outside the windows stretched long across the linoleum floor. Most people passed through without much thought. Grab a meal, check a phone, move on. But at table 7, just to the left of the soda fountain, sat a man who never quite moved on from anything. He wore a faded blue shirt, the kind with a collar that used to be stiff but had long since given in to age and wear. His khakis were clean but thin at the knees. The cloth hung a little loose around his frame. He carried a red towel slung over one shoulder and a spray bottle half filled with lemon cleaner. No name tag, no uniform. Just a quiet presence that drifted through the restaurant like he belonged there and yet didn't. Most people thought he was part-time staff, a cleaner. Some even joked he might live in the back, the way he seemed to always be there, but no one really asked. They just assumed. Because that's what we tend to do with people we don't notice. We assume. He moved slowly, with intention, one hand always steady on the edge of the table, the other wiping in small, even circles. Not fast, not showy, just quiet and consistent. When someone left a tray behind, he'd gather it without a word. If a child spilled soda, he was already there with napkins and a half smile before the mother even had a chance to apologize. He didn't seem bothered by the mess or the noise. In fact, it felt like he found rhythm in it. His name was Joe, but hardly anyone knew that. To the regulars, he was the table guy. To the younger staff, he was that older gentleman who doesn't clock in but somehow works here. In truth, he didn't collect a paycheck. He'd once asked the manager if he could just help out in exchange for a small meal at the end of the shift. No paperwork, no fuss, just something to do. The manager, young and overwhelmed, had agreed, more out of confusion than policy. That had been nearly 2 years ago. Now, Joe was just part of the background. No one questioned it anymore. He cleaned, he nodded, he ate quietly at the far booth before the place closed. Every night, same booth. Same burger, no fries, one coffee. That day, the dining area was about half full. The usual lunch crowd had come and gone. A few older couples lingered over coffee. One man in a cowboy hat was reading a newspaper, not even pretending to care about the digital world. 2 teenagers sat near the back, sharing earbuds and fries, barely talking. Then the doors opened, with a sudden gust of energy. 3 young adults stepped in, loud enough to shift the mood of the whole room. Not teenagers, early 20s maybe, all dressed like they'd come from a college party or a YouTube shoot. Designer sneakers, matching hoodies. Phones are out, cameras are already rolling before they even hit the counter. Kyle led the pack. Tall, lean, with a voice that never needed permission to speak louder than everyone else. Beside him, Jace had a gimbal in one hand, already filming a B-roll of ketchup dispensers and napkin holders as if they were props in a music video, and the girl, Melody, walked behind them, hair perfect, makeup on point, and a smirk that looked rehearsed. They weren't here for lunch, not really. Kyle glanced around the restaurant like it was a set he'd been given creative control over. He scanned for something interesting, something different, something they could exploit. And then he saw Joe. There he was, wiping down a table, moving slowly, towel in hand, oblivious to the fact that he had just become their target. Kyle nudged Melody. She followed his gaze and smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Joe was cleaning a ketchup streak someone had left behind. He leaned in close, careful not to knock the salt shaker. His hands were steady, despite the age in his knuckles. He didn't see the camera rise. Kyle spoke loudly enough to make sure everyone in earshot could hear. "Hey, boss man, think you missed a spot over here." Joe looked up, confused at first, then nodded slowly and turned toward their table. Melody called out as he approached. "Is that the same rag you've been using since '85? Jace snorted, catching her line on camera. Kyle added, "You got any updates on your cleaning software, sir? We're on version 10.3 out here." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, and it stuck. Joe didn't react much, just smiled faintly and wiped the edge of their table. They had nothing on their trays yet, they hadn't even ordered, but he cleaned anyway, because that's what he did. Kyle suddenly spilled a bit of his water, a quick flick of his hand, and the clear liquid spread across the tabletop. He made a face like it was an accident, but his grin betrayed him. "Oops, better mop that up, Chief. Wouldn't want anyone slipping on your shift." Joe stepped back, nodded again, and wiped the water carefully, corner to corner. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask why, just cleaned. Melody leaned in, her voice syrupy with fake kindness. "Do they let you sleep here too, or just work for food?" This time, a few heads turned. An older woman by the window looked over, lips tight. The man in the cowboy hat lowered his newspaper by an inch, but no one said anything. Not yet. Joe folded his towel once, then again, and placed it over the edge of his cart. He reached for the spray bottle. Kyle stood up. "Nah, don't spray it. I'm allergic to old people's lemon juice. Just wipe it with that ancient towel." More laughter, the kind that bounces off tile and makes the silence afterward feel too still. Joe gave a small shrug. His shoulders lifted, then dropped. He was used to that kind of laughter. It didn't hit the way it used to. It just passed through now, like wind. But Kyle wasn't done. "Hey man, you have a name, or do we just call you Janitor Prime?" Joe looked at him. For the first time, I really looked. Not with anger, not with sadness, just calm. "Joe, my name's Joe." Kyle nodded, like he'd just learned a new joke. "Joe the cleaner, got it. Thanks for your service, Joe. You've saved us from the terror of dirty tables." Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a single penny, and placed it carefully on the table. "For your retirement fund, Joe." Melody clapped once, sarcastically. Jace caught it all on camera. Joe looked at the penny, then at Kyle. He didn't touch it, didn't smile, just looked. He didn't say anything more, just turned and walked back to the next table. The air in the restaurant was thick now. Not quite tension, but discomfort. That subtle shift when people know something isn't right, but no one wants to be the first to say it. The man in the cowboy hat folded his newspaper. He stood up slowly, walked toward the trash bin, eyes steady on Kyle's table. But he didn't speak, just tossed his cup and walked out. Kyle chuckled. "Guess we're making folks uncomfortable. That's how you know the content's good." Jace added a note to the camera, voicing this part later. Title it, "Humbled by the Help." Melody flicked her hair and pulled out her phone to check their live stream stats. And Joe? He kept wiping. That's what part 1 is about. The moment before the line is crossed. The moment when mockery is still just words, and a towel is still just a towel. The moment when the world has a chance to do the right thing and chooses silence. But every story has a turning point. And sometimes that turning point walks in quietly. Sometimes it wears a denim jacket. Sometimes it orders a black coffee, sits in the back corner and watches everything unfold. And sometimes, when the moment's right, it stands up. The soda machine let out a mechanical hum as someone refilled their drink. Ice clinked against plastic. Fryers hissed faintly behind the counter. It was the kind of ambient noise that usually filled the background of everyday life, unnoticed. But after what just happened, the normal sounds felt a little too loud. Joe had made his way back to the corner booth, the same one he always returned to when things quieted down. He hadn't sat down yet, just stood beside the table, hands resting on the back of the seat, like he was trying to decide whether staying was worth the effort today. Kyle and his group were still laughing, though their volume had dropped just a bit. They weren't done, but they had sensed the discomfort in the room, that familiar edge where bold turns into bullying and where eyes begin to watch instead of ignore. But instead of backing off, they started whispering about the next move. Whispering, but not hiding. Jace leaned over his equipment, reviewing the footage they'd just captured. Melody scrolled through comments on their live stream, grinning whenever someone typed something cruel. Kyle, meanwhile, took a few steps toward the counter, grabbed a handful of napkins, then glanced back at Joe with mock concern. He waved the napkins like a peace offering, but everyone knew it was just the start of something worse. Joe turned slightly, ready to head toward the next table, when Kyle's voice called out again. This time, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. He asked if Joe could clean up a spill in the booth behind them, the one that was, of course, spotless. Joe paused, his eyes shifting toward the booth. He didn't argue, he just moved slowly in that direction. Before he reached it, though, Kyle took a full soda cup and tipped it gently onto the seat cushion. The soda spread fast, pooling in the corner, soaking the edge. Then he stepped back and waited. Joe reached the booth, saw the mess, and stood for a second longer than usual. His towel was already wet from earlier. His back was tired. He pulled it off his shoulder anyway and leaned forward to start cleaning. That's when Melody stepped up and dropped a half-open ketchup packet on the floor. It landed near Joe's foot, splattering just enough to catch the bottom hem of his pants. She said something about adding color to his outfit, and Kyle laughed again, but it didn't echo the same way. There was a shift, not a loud one, but real. A man by the window who had been quietly working on a laptop closed the lid. A woman near the door stopped eating and just stared at the group. Nobody said anything yet, but the kind of silence that was building wasn't passive anymore. It was waiting. Joe wiped up the ketchup without flinching. He didn't look at Melody. He didn't speak, but his hands moved more slowly now, not because he was tired, but because he was thinking, calculating. Not about fighting back, but about how much longer he could stand here and still walk out with his dignity. Jace lifted the camera again and pointed it low toward Joe's hands. He whispered to Melody to tilt her head just a bit and act like she was handing him something helpful. She posed with a napkin, pretending to smile, then whispered something sharp under her breath. That's when it happened. Jace accidentally bumped a tray of food left on the neighboring table. It slid, wobbled, and then fell with a loud clatter. A burger, fries, and drink hit the floor in a chaotic mess. Joe instinctively turned to help. He stepped forward, bent down, and reached to gather the items. Kyle saw it as his moment. He stepped in quickly, grabbed one of the fallen fries, and dropped it back onto the tray with exaggerated precision. Then he looked down at Joe and asked if he wanted a tip for his performance. Melody giggled, but even she looked like she wasn't sure if it was still funny. Joe stayed crouched, hands near the food but not touching it. His face was calm, but his shoulders were tight. There was no anger, no shame, just the stillness of someone who had already survived much worse. Then Kyle stepped forward again. He took the top bun of the fallen burger and pressed it down into the tray, smashing it flat. The sound of it squishing filled the silence. It wasn't loud, but it felt final. Joe stood slowly, keeping his eyes low. His hands brushed the towel once, then gripped it tighter than before. His knuckles had gone pale. Melody asked if he was going to cry. Jace made a fake sniffing sound. Kyle said maybe they'd gone too far, but smirked like he didn't mean it. And that's when someone else stood up. From the back booth, the man in the denim jacket rose without a word. He had been sitting with his coffee, untouched. No phone, no laptop, just watching, waiting. He was tall, broad, the kind of posture that doesn't come from the gym but from decades of carrying real weight. The denim looked old but strong. His boots were worn but firm. He moved with the quiet control of someone who didn't need attention but always got it anyway. Chuck Norris didn't need to speak to be noticed. The air just changed when he stood. He didn't walk fast. He didn't make a scene. He just stepped forward, eyes steady on the group, but mostly on Joe. When he reached the mess, he didn't stop at the burger or the spilt drink. He looked at the towel still clutched in Joe's hand. Then he turned to Kyle. The boy opened his mouth to say something, maybe a joke, maybe a protest, but nothing came out. Chuck's presence wasn't threatening, it was commanding. There's a difference. Threats require noise. Command needs only silence. Chuck's voice, when it came, was low and calm. He asked if that was supposed to be funny. Kyle stammered something about just playing around. Chuck didn't nod. He didn't argue. He looked back down at Joe, then asked if he was hurt. Joe shook his head, barely. Chuck turned back to Kyle. The camera was still rolling. Jace had kept it going, maybe out of habit or panic. Melody's hand hovered near her phone, unsure whether to record or hide it. Chuck looked at all of them, one by one. No raised voice, no threats. Just a pause. Then he said 6 words that didn't sound like much at first. You have no idea who he is. There was a pause after that, not for effect, but because truth doesn't need to rush. He repeated it, quieter this time. You have no idea who he is. Then Chuck stepped back, nodded once toward Joe, and did something no one expected. He knelt down and picked up the smashed burger himself. The restaurant had gone completely still. No footsteps, no orders, just the sound of that one gesture. He placed the pieces of the burger back on the tray as best he could. Then he stood, looked Kyle in the eye, and asked if he was proud of this. Kyle tried to laugh, but it broke halfway. He said they didn't mean anything by it, that it was all for content. Chuck looked at him, calm and clear. You don't humiliate people for content. You don't treat strangers like props. And you don't ignore a man's history just because he's wiping your table. His words weren't loud, but they landed like thunder. Joe still hadn't moved. He was frozen, unsure whether to speak or disappear. Chuck turned to him, nodded once, and said they were done here. Then he walked past them, slow and firm, toward the counter. He didn't look back. Kyle, Jace, and Melody stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do now. The camera was still recording, but even the comments had slowed. The people watching didn't know how to respond. It wasn't drama anymore. It was real. And reality is harder to edit. Joe finally sat down at the booth. He didn't touch the food. He just sat, hands on the table, shoulders quiet, like someone who had just survived another kind of battle. Outside, the sky had gone from bright to grey. A soft drizzle began tapping on the windows. The moment was over, but the story wasn't. And in the quiet that followed, something deeper had just begun. That's where part 2 ends, not with a bang, but with the kind of silence that demands reflection. And for some people, that's the moment they finally start to listen. Joe sat still at the booth, hands resting quietly on the table, while the drizzle outside softened into a steady, whispering rain. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to tint the windows in a pale grey glaze. Inside, the hum of the restaurant had returned, but the energy wasn't the same. It never is after something real happens. Kyle paced slowly near the soda machine, shoulders tense and jaw clenched. He wasn't sure if he was embarrassed or just exposed. For someone who lived on reactions, this silence was foreign. Melody sat near the corner of their booth, refreshing her phone with growing concern. The comments section on their live stream had turned. What started as laughing emojis and fire icons had shifted into discomfort. People were asking questions. Some were calling them out. Others had stopped watching altogether. Jace was still holding the camera, but now it felt heavier, like it wasn't a tool anymore, but more like evidence. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered it onto the table and avoided eye contact with anyone. Chuck Norris had returned to his seat at the back of the restaurant. He hadn't ordered anything new, just sat with his coffee, one arm resting along the edge of the booth. He didn't need to say more. He already had. Joe hadn't moved. He didn't touch the tray. Didn't touch his towel. He just sat there, absorbing the weight of the moment. It wasn't new to him, the ridicule, the mockery, the silence from those around. But something about this day felt different. Maybe it was the way Chuck stood up. Maybe it was the fact that someone had finally noticed. A young staff member came over, a kid who looked like he'd just graduated from high school. He offered Joe a fresh cup of coffee and set it down with quiet hands. He didn't say anything, but he lingered for a moment. Joe gave him a small nod. That was enough. Then the air shifted again. Kyle, trying to reclaim control, walked over to Joe's booth. His steps were slower now, less arrogant, but his voice still carried that same edge of false confidence. He said he didn't mean anything by it, that they were just making content, just trying to be funny. Joe looked up at him for the first time since the incident. There was no anger in his eyes, no pity either, just tired truth. The kind of truth that doesn't argue, it just exists. Kyle said maybe if Joe didn't act so strange, people wouldn't treat him like a joke. Said maybe if he spoke up more, they'd know he wasn't just some old guy trying to hang around for free food. He waited for a reaction, but Joe stayed quiet. Then Kyle leaned in closer and dropped his voice. He asked Joe if he'd always been invisible, or if it just happened after life passed him by. That line wasn't meant to be cruel, at least not entirely. It came from a place Kyle didn't fully understand himself. Joe didn't blink, didn't flinch, but this time he spoke, softly, slowly. He said, "People aren't invisible because of age or silence. People become invisible when others stop looking for who they are and start assuming who they were." Then he looked at Kyle and asked a simple question. "What would you do if no one ever asked your name again?" The words didn't shout, but they pierced. Kyle stepped back like he'd been nudged in the chest. For a second, he didn't speak. Then he tried to laugh it off, but it came out wrong, forced. Melody turned in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. She picked up her phone, checked the stream again, and then did something she rarely did. She turned it off, just closed the app. Not because she was afraid, but because something inside her knew the moment wasn't meant to be shared. It was meant to be learned from. Chuck watched from a distance, still saying nothing. His silence was not passive, it was deliberate. There's a kind of presence that doesn't need to interrupt. It just holds space. And for the people in that Burger King, that space was starting to feel like accountability. Then Kyle did something unexpected. He walked toward the trash can, holding the crushed burger from earlier, and tossed it out. Not dramatically, not for attention, he just did it. Maybe if he started small, he could reset something. Joe watched him go, but didn't follow. The rain outside grew steadier. A few cars passed by, their tires hissing across the wet pavement. Inside, the tension was thinning, not gone, but shifting into reflection. A woman at a nearby table turned to Joe and asked quietly if she could get him a new tray of food. He smiled, thanked her, but declined, said he was fine, said he wasn't hungry anymore. That answer said more than it sounded. Melody stood slowly, brushed crumbs from her skirt and walked toward Joe. Her voice was lower now, and there were no cameras, no followers, and no filter. She apologized, said they went too far, said she didn't know his story and had no right to make one up for him. Joe looked up and asked her what story she was trying to tell. She hesitated, then said it was supposed to be funny. Light. Just a bit of content to go viral. He nodded, then asked what it cost her to go viral. She didn't answer. Chuck rose again, this time not to confront, but to close the distance. He walked over and stood beside Joe, hands resting at his sides, eyes scanning the group. He asked them if they believed in value. Not market value, not view count, real value. The kind you earn by showing up every day, by doing the hard thing when no one's watching, by keeping your head down without letting your heart grow small. He pointed to Joe, then said, "This man has value, not because of what he does, but because of what he's done, because of what he carries." Then he looked at the group and asked them another question. "Who do you carry?" There was no easy answer. Jace cleared his throat and tried to explain that they were just trying to get people to laugh. Chuck looked at him and said that laughter without respect was just noise, and the world already has too much of that. Then Chuck asked them one last thing. "Do you want to be remembered for what you built or what you tore down?" Again, no answer, just the rain against the windows and the faint buzz of a neon sign outside. Joe finally stood, his hands resting briefly on the table before he rose. He stretched slightly, adjusted the towel on his shoulder and turned to Chuck. "You always show up when people forget how to act, don't you?" Chuck smiled, just a little. "Only when they forget too loudly." They shared a brief glance, two men who had seen different versions of the same kind of pain. Men who knew what it meant to stand alone, but also what it meant when someone finally stood with them. Kyle stepped forward again. This time his voice was different. He said he was sorry that he didn't know, that it wasn't right, and that he would do better. Joe looked at him and said something that will probably stay with him forever. Doing better starts when you stop needing a camera to prove you're trying. Then he walked past them, slowly, toward the back of the restaurant. Not defeated, not embarrassed, just finished. Chuck followed a few steps behind. They haven't left yet. Not because they needed to stay. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remain visible, present, unafraid to hold the space others are still learning how to step into. The staff began quietly cleaning up the scattered trays and napkins. The young manager, who had been frozen near the counter the whole time, finally stepped out and thanked Joe. Not for the cleaning, but for the example. Joe just smiled and nodded. He said it was nothing, but everyone knew it was something. That was the end of part 3. A moment where the story shifted not because of a fight, but because of a choice. A choice to respond with dignity instead of anger. A choice to lead not with power, but with presence. And for anyone paying attention, especially those who value influence and connection, it was a reminder. The way we carry ourselves in small moments reveals more than any speech or title ever could. And sometimes the strongest message comes from the quietest man in the room. Chuck stood still for a moment after speaking, letting the silence work. Not all silence is weakness. Some silence is earned. The kind that settles into a room and makes people sit up straighter, breathe slower, and think harder. Kyle's hands were in his pockets now and his shoulders were no longer square. He looked smaller than he had 10 minutes ago. Not physically, but inwardly. The way a young man starts to feel when his sense of control crumbles and all that's left is reflection. Melody had taken a seat, not in their booth, but in one of the plastic chairs along the far wall. Her phone was off. Her eyes were lowered. You could tell something was shifting in her, though she probably couldn't name it yet. Jace still had the camera in his lap. His fingers were tracing the edges of the lens without purpose. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just trying to stay in the moment without fully stepping into it. Chuck stepped back, giving Joe space, not physically but emotionally. Some moments don't need a savior, they need a witness, and Chuck knew the difference. Joe stood steady. His back wasn't perfectly straight, but there was strength in the way he carried himself. The kind of posture that doesn't demand respect, but quietly reminds people why it's deserved. He looked around the room. Not with pride, not with pity, just presence. Real, grounded presence. Then his voice came, steady and low, not meant to impress, but to connect. He said the first thing people ever forgot about him was his name. Then came his job, then his history, and finally the way they looked at him. He said it didn't happen all at once. It never does. It comes in layers. People stop asking questions. They start assuming. And then one day you realize you've disappeared without ever leaving. The room stayed quiet. No one moved. He looked at Kyle again, said he didn't blame him. That youth often mistakes attention for importance. But real importance, he said, comes from the people who keep showing up when no one's watching. The ones who hold doors open, fix things without applause, and say good morning even when no one says it back. That's when Chuck turned slightly. His boots shifted across the tile. He looked at Kyle, then said 5 words that shifted the energy of the room. "You know who he is?" Kyle blinked. Chuck didn't wait. He answered the question himself. "He's the man your father once knelt in front of." The room froze. Kyle's expression flickered, confused at first, then something deeper. Chuck took a step forward, not threatening, just closing the distance. Then he said something that landed hard and clean. "Years ago, during the flood, your father's truck stalled under the bridge near County Road 6. Waters were rising fast. He had your sister in the back seat, barely 2 years old. The current was too strong. The door wouldn't open." Kyle's eyes widened. His mouth opened just slightly, as if the memory was knocking and he hadn't recognized it yet. Chuck continued. People on the shore watched. No one moved except for one man. He dove in, broke the window with a tire iron, pulled your sister out with one arm and held your father above water with the other, until help arrived. He paused, then said plainly, "That man was Joe." Kyle didn't speak. He just stood there, still, eyes locked on Joe like he was seeing him for the first time. Chuck didn't stop. "Your father didn't just thank him, he cried, dropped to his knees, said he'd name a street after him if he could. But Joe never asked for anything. Not a medal, no recognition. He just shook his head, said he was glad they were okay, and walked away." Now Pyle looked shaken. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. He said he thought that story was just something his dad told to scare him into respecting people. Chuck nodded slowly. "That's the problem with stories. If you don't carry them right, they fade. And when they fade, so does the meaning." Then he turned toward Melody. He said, "Beauty fades, followers vanish, algorithms change, but the way you made someone feel stays. And if you're lucky, the best version of yourself isn't the one in front of the camera. It's the one who chooses silence over shame, the one who puts the phone down and actually listens." Melody's eyes filled slightly. She wiped them fast, tried to hide it, but the shift was there. Jace looked down again, still silent. Chuck walked back to Joe. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside him. Then, in the stillness, Joe reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it in both hands like it meant something. Then he opened it slowly and showed it to Kyle. It was a photograph, old, slightly water-damaged, but clear enough to see 2 men standing in chest-deep water, arms locked, with a baby cradled in a soaked jacket between them. One of the men was Joe. The other was a younger man in uniform, Kyle's father. Joe handed the photo to Chuck, who held it with quiet reverence. Then Joe said he only kept it for one reason. He needs to remind himself that when the world forgets, someone still remembers. Kyle took a slow breath. His hands were trembling now. He reached forward, touched the photo gently, then pulled his hand back like it burned. He whispered that he didn't know, that he had no idea, and that he was sorry. Chuck looked at him again, not with judgment, but with clarity. He said, "Sorry is a good start, but only if it leads to change. Real change isn't loud, it's consistent. The way you speak to people when you don't need anything from them. The way you carry yourself when no one's looking." Then Chuck handed the photo back to Joe. And that's when the air in the room shifted again. A woman near the front stood up. She looked like someone's grandmother, hair pulled back, purse clutched close. She said she remembered that flood, said she remembered seeing a man in a soaked uniform walking through the water, carrying a baby against his chest. She looked at Joe and said, "Thank you," said she never forgot that image. Then a man near the window added that he was working at the firehouse back then. Joe came in, dripping wet, dropped the jacket on a bench and said someone else might need it more. Bit by bit, memories returned. Voices joined in. People began to remember. At that moment, Joe wasn't invisible anymore. He was seen, truly seen. Chuck stepped back. Not to retreat, but to let the moment belong to Joe. And Joe, steady as ever, just nodded quietly and said thank you. Not for the attention, but for being remembered. Joe remained standing. The photograph was now tucked back into his pocket. He didn't linger in the praise, didn't bask in the shift of energy. He simply acknowledged it the way a man who has spent a lifetime unnoticed would with stillness. Chuck stepped slightly to the side, arms resting loosely at his sides. He wasn't trying to draw attention anymore. He had done what was needed. Now, like any seasoned leader, he made room for someone else's strength to show. The staff manager quietly whispered something to the assistant near the counter. Within a minute, a new meal was being prepared. No one made an announcement, no one said it out loud, but everyone knew it was for Joe. Kyle still stood, slightly behind his father, eyes low. He had heard every word, seen every shift in body language. The bravado was gone. But something better had taken root, a kind of discomfort that leads to growth, if handled right. His father, Principal Kessler, looked between Joe and his son. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He turned to Kyle and asked why. Not what, not how, just why. Kyle hesitated, then answered in a voice that barely made it across the floor. He said it was for the views, for the likes, for the way the internet rewards the wrong kind of bold. He said he didn't think anyone would care, that people scroll, that nothing sticks. The honesty in that answer did more than any excuse could have. Kessler nodded slowly, then said something many parents struggle to say. He admitted that he had failed too. Not because he didn't care, but because he stopped teaching the deeper values once Kyle hit a certain age. He said he let busyness fill in for guidance, and that now he understood the cost. Joe didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His silence was part of the lesson now. Chuck listened with that same attentive focus, not reacting, just absorbing. When people are finally telling the truth, the best thing you can do is let them finish. Then Kyle stepped forward. It wasn't a grand gesture. Just a few small steps toward the man he had tried to humiliate an hour earlier. His hands were in front of him, fingers interlaced tightly. He cleared his throat, then said that when he was younger, his dad used to tell him stories about heroes, about soldiers, about firefighters. But Kyle always thought those stories were meant for bedtime. He never saw them in real life, not until today. He looked Joe in the eye and said he was sorry, not because it was the polite thing to say, but because something inside him was breaking open in the right way. Joe didn't offer forgiveness immediately. Instead, he asked Kyle a question. He asked if he understood what it cost to be silent when someone else is suffering. Kyle nodded. Then Joe asked something else. Something harder? He asked. Would you have stopped if Chuck hadn't stood up? The question landed with a deep pause. Kyle's eyes dropped. His shoulders slumped just a bit. He shook his head. That's when Joe gave the first sign of grace. He said that most people don't choose compassion. They're startled into it, and that being startled is fine, as long as it leads to something better. Melody had moved closer now. Her arms were crossed, not defensively, but protectively. She looked older than she had at the start of the day. Not in years, in awareness. She said she had filmed dozens of people like Joe, pretending to hand them things, faking interviews, all for clicks. She said it made her sick now, not because of guilt, but because it took this long for her to realize. Joe looked at her and asked what she would do differently tomorrow. She said she would ask someone's name before she judged their story. He nodded and said, "That's a good place to begin." Across the restaurant, one of the older guests stood up and walked over. He didn't say much, just reached out and placed a small silver pin in Joe's hand. It was the kind given at the end of a long civil service, the kind that rarely gets noticed unless someone truly pays attention. The man said he'd carried it since his own retirement, but that it belonged with someone who had lived its meaning. Joe held it for a moment, then nodded his thanks. Chuck shifted his weight slightly and walked to the front of the room. The air changed as he moved, not out of intimidation, but out of attention. He wasn't trying to take over, he was offering closure. He looked around the room and said, "That honor isn't a ceremony, it's a decision. It's how you treat someone when no one is grading you for it. When you think no one is watching, it is important." Then he added that a man like Joe didn't earn his respect today. He had it from the start. It was the rest of them who had some catching up to do. Someone near the counter said quietly that it felt like church. Not the kind with pews and stained glass, the kind where people come clean and walk out changed. Joe smiled faintly. He said he'd never expected to teach anything, just wanted to feel useful. Chuck turned to him and said that being useful is the first form of leadership, the one no one teaches, but everyone feels. The meal for Joe arrived. Fries hot, burger fresh, apple pie still warm in the box. He didn't eat right away, just sat with it in front of him, hands folded. Then, for the first time since he walked into the place that day, Joe looked out across the room and asked if anyone else was hungry. Not for food, for understanding. A few people chuckled gently, not mockery, just recognition. Melody stepped forward again and asked if Joe had always been this calm. He answered that calm doesn't come from having less to feel, it comes from surviving enough storms that nothing rattles you the same way anymore. Chuck looked at Kyle, then said growth is never convenient, but it's always worth the mess. Jace finally spoke. He said he wasn't sure what to do with all the footage. He didn't know if he should delete it or post it. Chuck looked him straight in the eye and said, "You ask the man whose story you tried to rewrite." Jace turned to Joe. Joe said, "Keep it, not for followers, but for memory. Post the truth, not the version that gets attention." Jace nodded. Then he added, "Maybe for once we show people what humility looks like when it's real." Chuck said, "Then you'd better show the whole thing." The moment Joe stood up, the silence, the spill, the look in his eyes. Not just the part where the hero shows up, but the part where you didn't. People need to see that more than they need to see me. The words landed quietly because they didn't need to be loud. Joe picked up the apple pie, broke it in half, offered one side to the staff member who had brought it to him. It was a small gesture, but it felt bigger than most speeches. As the room settled, one by one, people began gathering their things, but slower than usual, not in a rush to leave. Some walked over to Joe, shook his hand or placed a note on the edge of his tray. No one said anything dramatic. just a nod, a touch, a thank you. Chuck stood by the door, holding it open as people passed through. He said nothing, just met their eyes. And in that eye contact, most people got the message. Be better next time. Show up sooner. Remember longer. When the restaurant was nearly empty, Chuck walked back to Joe. They sat side by side in the booth. No camera, no audience, just two men. One tired, one quietly watchful. Chuck said he'd be leaving town the next day, but that if Joe ever needed anything, he'd show up. Joe smiled, then said, "You already did." Outside, the rain had lightened to a mist. Soft streaks ran down the windows like quiet reminders that the world was still moving. But inside that Burger King, time had paused, not because of any grand announcement, but because of memory. And what happens when memory returns with weight? Joe stood steady, not proud, not shy, just fully present. The weight of silence had lifted, not completely, but enough for people to breathe again. He didn't speak much after that. There wasn't a need. The power had shifted, without anger. It had shifted with truth. Chuck remained near, but no longer at the center. A good leader knows when to step forward and when to step back. He'd made his presence known. Now, his presence allowed space for others. Then the front doors opened, not with drama, but with purpose. A tall man in a dark suit stepped in. His hair was silver at the sides, pressed flat, his tie perfectly centered. He scanned the room, taking in the quiet, the stillness, and the strange expressions on the faces around him. This was Principal Raymond Kessler, head of the local high school, Kyle's father. He didn't walk fast, but his steps were firm. He looked toward Kyle, who hadn't noticed him enter. Then his eyes locked on Joe. Recognition flickered, then something deeper, something personal. Chuck watched the moment, the way Kessler's eyes settled on Joe with a mixture of shock and guilt. He didn't blink for a while. Then he exhaled hard, like he'd been holding his breath for years. Kyle turned, saw his father, froze. Kessler walked toward Joe without a word. Not a glance at his son, not yet. His focus was fixed. When he reached Joe, he stopped, standing straight but not stiff. Then he spoke. He said he didn't expect to see him here, that he should have come sooner, that silence, when it goes on too long, becomes a kind of betrayal. Joe looked up. No tension, no blame. Just the quiet kind of attention that makes a man speak from the chest, not the mouth. Kessler said Joe had saved his life, not just during the flood, but afterward. He said that Joe had been a model of service and humility, and that the town owed him more than forgotten memories and leftover coffee. Then he did something no one expected. He knelt, right there on the tile floor of a fast food restaurant, in front of everyone. It wasn't for show. He didn't look around. He didn't explain. He just bowed his head slightly and said, "Thank you." And, "I'm sorry." The room didn't breathe. Not out of shock, but reverence. Kyle watched, stunned. He'd never seen his father kneel. Not once. Not for anyone. Not in church. Not at funerals. Never. Then Kessler stood, not quickly, not slowly. He placed a hand on Joe's shoulder and said the world didn't deserve men like him. But that didn't mean it shouldn't try harder to remember them. Joe nodded, saying that remembering was enough, that being seen, even just once, could carry a man through a lot. Then, finally, Kessler turned to his son. Kyle didn't speak. He didn't run, he stood still, hands at his sides, like a boy waiting to be sent home. Kessler asked him one question. "Did you know who he was?" Kyle said, "No." His father nodded, not with approval, but with the sadness of a lesson delivered late. Then he said something unexpected. "Neither did I," he admitted. "Not really, not fully, and that's on me." Kyle blinked. His posture shifted. He had expected judgment. Instead, he received ownership. And that changed something. Kessler turned to Chuck. They had never met, but names like his don't need much introduction. He extended a hand. Chuck took it. Then Kessler said something quietly, something just between the two of them. Chuck nodded. Nothing more, just enough to seal whatever understanding passed between men who carry responsibility like armor. The moment was settling when the young manager approached. He held a small envelope in one hand, looked nervous but determined. He offered it to Joe, said it was from the corporate office, that someone had flagged Joe's ID in the system for irregular hours. He was told to let him go, politely. The room went cold. Chuck raised an eyebrow but didn't speak, yet. Joe didn't reach for the envelope, he just stood there. The manager explained that Joe wasn't technically an employee, that there was no paperwork, no payroll, no insurance, that the lawyers wouldn't approve it, not anymore. Said he was sorry, said he didn't want to do this, but the call had already been made. Then Joe did something only a few noticed. He smiled. Not bitterly, not sadly, just simply. He said he understood that the world worked on paper now, not present. He was grateful to have lasted this long. Chuck looked at the manager, then said 5 words, calm and sharp. Who made that decision exactly? The manager hesitated. Said it came from the regional office, higher up, that someone had sent a report. There were policies. Chuck didn't blink. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a phone, not flashy, not loud, just one call. He stepped to the side, dialed, waited. The phone rang twice. Then his voice, low and direct. He said he needed to speak to Mitchell, yes. Mitchell West. Said it was about a man named Joseph Reed. Pause. Yes. That Joseph Reed. Pause. He handed the phone to the manager. The kid took it like he was holding a live wire. His voice cracked when he answered. Said, hello. Then, yes sir. Then again. And again. Then he nodded. 3 times. When he handed the phone back, his hands were shaking. Chuck put the phone away and said nothing. The manager turned to Joe. He said the corporate office wanted to extend an apology and an offer, a formal title, a monthly stipend, and, if he wanted it, a plaque with his name and service history should be on the wall. Joe shook his head, said he didn't need a plaque, didn't need a title, just wanted the towel back and the freedom to wipe down the tables without paperwork. The manager nodded fast, said course, said whatever he needed. Chuck looked at Joe and smiled, then at the others, and said sometimes, dignity doesn't come from being hired, it comes from being honored. Then someone clapped. One clap, sharp, alone. Then another joined in, and another. Soon the whole restaurant filled with applause, not loud, not staged, just on. Kyle stepped forward again, this time slower. His voice didn't shake, but it was softer. He said he was sorry not just to Joe but to everyone who had to watch. He said he'd never understood what service really looked like until today. He paused, then added that he wanted to change. Joe didn't say anything. He just extended a hand. Kyle took it. Then Chuck turned to the rest of the room, looked at every face, young, old, staff, guests, and he asked a question that stayed with people long after the day ended. When you leave here today, who will you remember? The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. A respectful one, a remembering one. The booths were nearly empty now. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The air looked clean again, like the sky itself had taken time to listen and now was ready to move on. Joe leaned back slightly, his hand resting on the tray. The apple pie was gone. A half cup of coffee remained. He sipped it slowly, not because it was hot, but because he was still holding on to the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention, just a little room to breathe. Kyle was still there, not out of obligation but out of something deeper. His father had stepped outside to take a call, but Kyle had stayed. He sat across from Joe, no phone in hand, no camera pointed, just himself. For a long minute no one spoke. Then Kyle asked the question he hadn't dared say until now. Why did you keep coming back here day after day, wiping down tables for which no one thanked you? Joe didn't answer right away. He looked out the window first, then at the salt shaker, the napkin holder, and finally at Kyle. He said that every morning he woke up, he needed a reason to move. Not a big one. Just something real. A table with crumbs was enough. A chair is out of place. A ketchup stain left behind by a family that probably didn't know his name. He said, "When you lose people, you look for structure, and if the world doesn't offer it, you build your own, even if all it looks like is one clean booth at a time." Kyle sat with that answer for a while. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't fill the silence. That in itself showed growth. Then Chuck returned. He stepped back into the room, like someone who knew when to leave and when to come back. He nodded at Joe, then at Kyle. Then he looked around and saw Jace and Melody still sitting near the far wall. Their cameras were off, their expressions were softer. They watched this whole scene from start to finish. Something in them had changed. Chuck walked over and said that stories like this aren't written for likes, they're written into people. He looked at Melody and asked if she remembered what she said earlier about filters and editing. She nodded. Then he told her the truth never needs polishing, just someone brave enough to tell it plain. Melody smiled faintly. Then she asked Joe if she could ask one last question. He nodded. She asked how he stayed so patient, how he didn't snap, or didn't fight, didn't raise his voice when he had every right to. Joe set his cup down, folded his hands and said, "Patience isn't about swallowing anger. It's about respecting your own peace too much to give it away cheap." He said, "You don't protect dignity by yelling. You protect it by not letting cruelty pull you out of who you are." Chuck added that real power isn't how loud you are, it's how solid you are when the room's shaking. Jace looked up and said he was thinking about the video again, about posting the full cut. He said he wasn't sure how people would respond, that it might make them look bad. Chuck nodded. "Then, if you're afraid of how the truth makes you look, maybe it's not the truth that needs changing." It was a simple statement, but it worked. Jace stood. He said he'd post it all, every second, no edits, no commentary. Just the story, as it happened. Chuck said, "Then post the part where you sat there and said nothing. That's the part people need to see, too." Jace agreed. Melody added that if people could see her shame, maybe they'd pause before adding to someone else's. Then Joe stood again. Same posture, same pace. He picked up his tray, carried it to the return bin and wiped the edge like he always did, not because he had to, because it was who he was. As he turned back, a new face entered the restaurant. A woman in a dark blazer, late 50s, composed but rushed. She looked around the room, spotted Chuck, and then approached. She introduced herself as Sarah Whitmore from the Office of Veterans Affairs. She had heard about what happened from a mutual friend in the state government, a friend who had received a phone call from someone named Mitchell, prompted by someone named Chuck. She said the story was traveling fast, that Joe's name was now being submitted for a statewide honor. A ceremony was being planned at the Capitol next month. Joe looked surprised, even a little uncomfortable. He said he wasn't sure what he'd done to deserve any of that. Sarah smiled. She said, "Sometimes you don't do it in one moment, you do it in 1,000 small ways no one has noticed until now." Chuck stood beside her and said, "Recognition doesn't make a man honorable. But sometimes honoring a man helps the rest of us Remember what we should aim to be. Joe finally nodded. He said he'd go, not for the ceremony, for the conversation. He wanted to remind people that invisible service is still service. Sarah handed him a small folder with information, a formal invitation, and her card. Then she left, just as quickly as she had come. Kyle stepped forward one more time. He asked if he could help with anything going forward. He said he didn't want the story to end here. Joe looked at him and said, "The story only ends if you forget." Then he added, "If you really want to help, show up when no one's asking you to." Kyle said he would. And for the first time that day, it sounded like a promise that would hold. Chuck turned to Joe and asked if he was ready to go. Joe looked around the room, at the booths, the floor, the tray bin, then back to Chuck. He said, "Yeah, it's clean enough for today." They walked toward the exit together. As they reached the door, the young manager stopped them. He handed Joe a folded apron with his name stitched in white. He said it wasn't from corporate. It was from the staff. A thank you they'd been meaning to give him but never found the right time. Joe took it gently. He ran his fingers over the stitching, then smiled. Then he placed the apron back in the manager's hands and said he'd come back tomorrow to wear it. One more day. One more table. And with that, he stepped outside with Chuck into the light of a clearing afternoon. The sky wasn't dramatic. It was just open. Theme. Possible. And as they walked together down the sidewalk, Chuck placed one hand on Joe's shoulder. He didn't say much. He just said, "They'll remember this time." And Joe replied, "Let's hope they remember the right parts." Chuck nodded, then said, "If they don't, we'll remind them." And with that, they disappeared into the slow rhythm of a town just beginning to understand who had always been among them. The sun was setting low across the hills when Joe stepped out of the car. The air was cool and dry, the kind that carries a quiet dignity in it, not flashy, just honest. Capitol Hall stood ahead of him, tall and still, wrapped in red, white, blue banners that fluttered just enough to feel ceremonial. He wore a clean button-down tucked into his only pair of pressed pants. On his chest, pinned with care, was a small bronze service pin. Nothing loud, just something that meant something. Beside him, Chuck adjusted the collar of his denim jacket. Still his style, still steady. He didn't change clothes for the cameras or the politicians. He showed up as he was, because that had always been enough. They stood at the edge of the entrance for a moment, letting the breeze pass over them. Around them, veterans and family members were arriving. Some walked slowly with canes or held onto grandchildren. Others moved with practiced posture, uniforms that still fit after years of discipline. Joe didn't speak. Not because he had nothing to say. Sometimes presence does more than language ever could. Inside the hall, the seats were nearly full. Rows of folding chairs stretched all the way to the main stage. Each seat had a small program folded on it. Gold lettering printed across the top read, "State Veterans Honor Ceremony." Chuck led the way down the side aisle, guiding Joe toward the front. They weren't early, they weren't late, they were exactly on time. As they passed row by row, heads turned. Some recognized Chuck instantly, others noticed Joe and gave small nods of respect. Not everyone knew who he was, but somehow it felt like they understood who he represented. 3 rows from the front, Kyle stood in a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled neatly at the cuff. He was handing out programs with slow, deliberate motion. Every time an elderly guest reached out, he looked them in the eye, asked if they needed a hand, offered his arm when it was needed, and stepped aside when it wasn't. When he saw Joe, his face changed. Not with panic, with something like reverence. He nodded once, then approached slowly. Joe paused. Let him come. Kyle reached out gently, offering to help him to his seat. Joe accepted the gesture, not because he needed the help, but because sometimes letting someone serve is a gift you give them. They said very little, just shared the kind of eye contact that carries meaning people usually miss when they're talking too much. Once Joe was seated, Chuck stepped off to the side, standing against the wall like someone who never minded being the one in the background. Near the front of the stage, a few people gathered. A military color guard waited in formation. A podium stood at the center. To the left, a small group of brass musicians sat holding instruments with polished care. The hum of anticipation hovered in the room, but it wasn't restless, it was respectful. At 6 p.m. sharp, the lights dimmed slightly, and the room quieted. A man in a dark suit stepped onto the stage, holding a slim folder and scanning the room with practiced comfort. He welcomed everyone and introduced the evening as a moment not for fanfare, but for gratitude. Not for performance, but for presence. As names were called, veterans walked across the stage one by one. Some used canes, some walked alone, others were helped gently by spouses or younger volunteers. Each name was met with a small wave of applause, not overwhelming, just consistent, like a heartbeat, steady, earned. Then, toward the end, the speaker paused. He looked down at his notes. Then, up again. He said the next name wasn't listed in the program. That's because the recognition hadn't been scheduled. It had been requested by someone who believed that some forms of service aren't tied to rank or title, but to the weight a man carries quietly, year after year. Then he said it. Joseph Reed. There was a hush. A few heads turned. Then, slowly, Joe stood. He didn't rush, didn't stumble, he didn't straighten his shoulders for applause. He simply rose. And as he began to walk toward the stage, something remarkable happened. People began to stand, one by one, not in a wave, not in a rush, just naturally. It was as if every person in that room instinctively knew they were watching someone who didn't ask to be noticed, but had earned the right to be seen. When Joe reached the stage, the speaker stepped aside and let him take the microphone. Joe looked out at the crowd, at the faces, young, old, some teary, some smiling. Then he began to speak. He said he wasn't supposed to be here. He said that he had worked at a Burger King for 2 years. He didn't wear a medal or march in parades. He said most people thought he was a janitor. Some thought he was lost. But he wasn't. He was where he needed to be. He said he'd lost a lot. His wife, his house, the rhythm of being needed. But every day, when he wiped down a table, he was reminding himself he still had something to offer. Not everyone understood that. But those who do know, it's not about the job, it's about the care. He paused. The room was silent. Then he said something that made everyone lean in just a little closer. He said service doesn't end with retirement. It doesn't stop because your knees ache or your name isn't called anymore. Real service is quiet. It keeps going even when nobody claps, even when people laugh, even when they forget your name. Because if you still have hands to lift someone else's burden, you're not done yet. The room stayed still. Then he added, I didn't need this ceremony, but maybe you did. Not to honor me, to remember the ones you walk past, the ones who hold the door, who carries the trays, who shows up not for attention, but for a purpose. He stepped back. The applause started small, then grew, but never chaotic. It was the kind of clapping that came from the chest. That said, we see you now, and we won't forget. Chuck watched from the side, arms folded. He didn't smile big, just enough. Later, as people mingled, shook hands, and slowly filtered out into the evening light, Joe sat quietly near the front row. Kyle brought him a bottle of water. Melody and Jace approached, not with cameras, but with gratitude. Jay said the video was live. that it was already being shared faster than anything they'd ever posted. But this time, it wasn't going viral for laughs. It was moving people. Chuck asked how the comments looked. Jace said they were different. People weren't just reacting. They were remembering, telling stories, mentioning names of old teachers, janitors, and grandfathers, people they had forgotten to thank. Joe nodded and said softly, "Maybe that's what this was really about. Not just being seen, but helping others see." The ceremony was over, but no one was in a rush to leave. That's the thing about quiet moments that touch something true. People linger. They want to sit in the feeling a little longer and let it settle in places where everyday life doesn't always reach. Joe stood near the stage, sipping from a paper cup, surrounded by a few people who had walked up quietly, some to shake his hand, others just to say thank you. Not long thank yous, just enough to mean something. Kyle stayed close by, not in the way a child clings after being scolded, but in the way someone does when they know they've been changed by someone else's example. One woman brought over an envelope. Inside was a simple letter. No return address. Just a note written in blue pen. It said, "I worked with your wife at the post office. She always said you had a good heart. I believe her now." Joe folded it slowly, placed it in his shirt pocket, then tapped the fabric with 2 fingers like sealing a memory. Chuck came over and stood beside him. He didn't speak right away, just looked out across the room as the last few guests made their way toward the exit. Then he said something soft, just enough for Joe to hear. He turned a fast food floor into a classroom. Joe smirked, just slightly. It wasn't planned. Chuck nodded. The best teaching is never. They walked together through the side door of the hall. The sky had turned that perfect shade of gold dew, the kind of evening that made you feel like you were standing at the end of something and the beginning of something else. The parking lot was nearly empty. Joe's car was parked in the far corner, the same spot he always chose. Chuck offered to drive. Joe declined with a quiet smile, said the slow ride home would help him think. Before they parted, Kyle jogged over. He asked if he could stop by the next day, just to talk. Joe said yes. "But bring your questions, not your camera." Kyle said he would. Chuck gave the boy a look, one of those firm, grounding looks, then placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't waste this." Kyle nodded. And that was that. They drove off in different directions. But something between them stayed connected. For example, when people walk out of the same fire, even if they don't arrive together. The next morning, Joe was back at Burger King. Same towel. Same walk. Same corner booth. But this time, when he stepped through the door, something was different. Not the smell of fries. Not the clatter of trays. But the way people looked at him. They didn't look away. They nodded. One of the younger staff members handed him a fresh towel. Not because he dropped it, just because she had washed it at home herself. He thanked her, then headed toward the window to check for streaks. As he wiped gently at the glass, a man stepped up to him, dressed in a blazer, holding a clipboard. Introduced himself as a journalist, said he'd seen the video, wanted to write something big. Joe looked at him. Eyes clear. He said, "Write what you need, but don't make me something I'm not. I'm just a man who stayed standing." The journalist asked why he didn't push back when they mocked him. Joe said that you don't fix cruelty by matching it. You fix it by outlasting it. He said he didn't stay quiet because he was weak. He stayed quiet because he remembered what it cost him to forget who he was. Later that week, the story made national headlines. Not because of Chuck, not even because of the boys, but because of a janitor who wasn't even on payroll, who reminded people what respect looked like. People started visiting the restaurant, not to take photos, but to shake hands. One man brought his teenage son. asked Joe if he could speak to me for 5 minutes. Joe said yes. Told the boy that being strong starts when you don't need to prove you are. Another woman brought coffee. He left it on the counter with a note that read, "For the quiet man who carried something the rest of us forgot to honor." Kyle came every day that week. Sometimes just to sit, sometimes to ask, sometimes to help clean up when the lunch rush was over. He didn't talk much anymore, but when he did, it came from a deeper place. He asked Joe once what the hardest part of losing respect had been. Joe said it wasn't the insults. It was the absence, the feeling of being erased, of walking through your own town and seeing the way people looked through you, not at you. Chuck came by twice that month. Once, just to share a meal. Once, sit in the booth across from Joe and let him talk about his wife. They didn't discuss heroics. They talked about groceries, about grief, about how some mornings the act of putting on socks feels like a small win. And both agreed that sometimes the most masculine thing a man can do is endure gently. Then came the letter from the city. A new Veterans Resource Center was being built downtown. They wanted to name it after someone local, someone who had served quietly, without applause, without a title. Joe declined at first, said it wasn't necessary, but Chuck told him something that finally changed his mind. He said if it carries your name, maybe people will pause before walking past the next Joe who sweeps their floor. Joe agreed. The Joseph Reed Center opened 6 months later. Kyle spoke at the ribbon cutting. He said he used to think influence came from attention. Now he knew it came from presence. Chuck spoke too. Briefly, he said Joe taught us that dignity is not a reaction. It's a habit, and that every booth he wiped down was a small act of leadership. When Joe took the mic, he said something most of the crowd hadn't expected. He said, "Thank you. Not for the center, not for the applause, but for remembering what mattered." He said memory is the last act of respect. And if you carry it well, it teaches others how to treat people long after you're gone. He placed the same bronze pin on the podium, the one Martin had given him, then walked away without a script. No speech, no notes, just a man walking like someone who had finished his shift but wasn't done working. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills again, Chuck and Joe sat outside the center. 2 chairs, 2 cups of black coffee. Nothing more. Chuck looked at him and said, "You know, it started with 5 words." Joe nodded. "I remember." Then he said, "And it ended with 1. Chuck asked, "Which one?" Joe said, "Stay." Chuck let the words sink in. Joe added, "People are so eager to leave, to move on, to fix, then flee. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay. Stay with someone in their shame. Stay in the uncomfortable silence. Stay long enough for the change to settle." Chuck nodded again, and for a while they just sat, in silence, in presence, in the peace that only comes after walking through something that mattered. And that's how the story ends. Not with a fight, not with a victory speech, but with 2 men sitting in the fading light of a long day, and one simple truth: you don't have to be loud to lead. You just have to stay long enough to matter.